out-of-work politician whose name was Juan Manuel Santos, interested in this project. And the Santos family owns the Bogota newspaper, El Tiempo, and is well connected. And within 2 weeks, they had organized a huge meeting, probably twice this big, with church leaders and ex-presidents and NGO people at the monastery, which is on the mountain above Bogota, called Montserrat. And it was a very dramatic meeting because just coming to this meeting to talk about the possibility of this work had brought people together who had never been together. I heard a story very recently that there was I remember from that meeting in 1996 that there was one guy who everybody was paying attention to, a very well-known paramilitary warlord who was there. And what I later heard is that there was a woman there, a Communist Party city councillor, who came to Santos, the organizer of the meeting, and said, "This man here has tried to have me assassinated 5 times, and you're asking me to sit down with him." And Santos said, "Madam, it is in order to avoid him trying a 6th time that I am inviting you to take your seat at the table." So that was the kind of meeting it was. There were various presentations given. I gave a presentation about the Montfleur scenarios, and then somebody's phone rang in the audience. It must have been the, just well, there you go. Thank you. This was, actually, we organized this thing. Bogota is surrounded by mountains, and there were then and still are 2 big guerrilla groups, left-wing revolutionary groups, who at that time occupied the mountains, had control of the mountains outside Bogota. And the meeting was being broadcast on FM radio, or an FM channel, so that they could listen and be informed and decide whether they wanted to participate in the exercise. And somebody's phone rang, and it was one of the guerrillas who wanted to ask a question of the speaker. And this question that was relayed to me was, "Mr. Kahane, can we come to a scenario workshop if we haven't agreed to if we're not willing or haven't agreed to a ceasefire?" And everybody's looking at me like I'm supposed to know the answer to this question. I didn't know the answer, but I guessed at an answer, which turned out to be a good answer, which is that there are no preconditions. This is not a negotiation. This is not about deciding anything. The only precondition is to be willing to talk and willing to listen. So, after that meeting, an organizing committee was set up, people were invited to participate, and the scenario work began at a beautiful rural meeting center, old farm buildings outside Medellin. The illegal guerrillas were offered, the government offered them safe passage to come to the meetings, but they didn't trust the government, and so we ended up organizing, and it was very extraordinary and dramatic, that they should participate in these meetings by telephone. 9 full days of meetings by telephone. 3 people who were in the political wing of the maximum security prison at Itagüí, and 1 who was in exile somewhere in Costa Rica. And even so, their participation was extraordinary, and most of the participants in the room, business people, politicians, NGO leaders, trade unionists, church leaders, it was really a dramatic experience for them to be in contact with these guerrillas. And I remember the speaker phones were in 2 parts of the room, and when we would take coffee breaks, people would walk and then give the speaker phones wide berth, not wanting to get too near them. I think it was in the first meeting, somebody came to me at one of the breaks and said, look, we're really frightened here, talking to the guerrillas. We don't know what's going to happen to us. And when the meeting started again, I said, so that everybody could hear, including the people on the phone, people have come to me and said that they're afraid to participate in this conversation. And one of the guerrillas, a man named Francisco Galan, Pacho Galan, said, I remember he said, Mr. Kahane, why are you surprised that people are afraid? People everywhere in Colombia are afraid. And in that sense, what's going on in the room is the dynamics within the room are a microcosm of the dynamics in the larger system. Anyhow, after talking about it for a while, they agreed a ground rule that nobody would be killed for anything they said in the meeting. I mean, outside the meeting, usual rules apply. But the mood really changed dramatically with something that important and that fundamental having been discussed. And now I notice during the coffee breaks, people would bring their coffee and sit next to the speakerphone and talk to the people on the other end. One of the things I noticed in the dynamics of this group, I got to know the stories of a lot of the people, and I realized that probably about half of the people, or a third of the people in the room, had lost somebody directly to the conflict that they were talking about, or to the violence they were talking about. Somebody's son had been kidnapped for what he, the father, had done. Somebody's wife or mother had been murdered. And yet it was, without exception, those people, the ones who had suffered most fundamentally from what was going on, it was those people who were the most open, and whose openness allowed, or whose woundedness, let me say, allowed the group to talk about what was really going on. There's one, I want to tell you one incident, because in some ways it's not only dramatic, but in some ways I think it is the emblematic incident, the incident that reveals the potential of this way of working. There was one of the members of the team was the Secretary General of the Communist Party of Colombia, a legal but extreme left-wing group, Jaime Caicedo. And we were at this farmhouse, and we had the whole place to ourselves, and in the evening we would sit around and people would talk and drink and play guitar. And one evening Jaime Caicedo was playing guitar with the former head of military intelligence and the most senior political figure in the right-wing paramilitary. And this guy from the paramilitary, I didn't talk to him much. We didn't have a language in common. But he was a big guy and really scary looking. And for the first 2 days, he didn't say anything. He just sat there like this. Guy, you know, this wide, just sat there like this. And the next morning, Jaime didn't show up. We started the meeting, we're all sitting in a circle. Jaime didn't show up. And I said, has anybody seen Jaime? You know, we're about to start. And then they started making jokes. The amazing thing about Colombians is they can make jokes really close to the bone. One of them said, oh yes, the general made him sing last night. And then Ivan Duque, this paramilitary guy who hadn't said a word in 2 days, said, I saw him last. Yeah, I was really scared. I thought, no, they did him in. Anyhow, a few minutes later he arrived and he had slept in. But the most interesting thing is I heard a coda to the story a few years ago. This guy, Ivan Duque, is now in prison, paramilitary guy in prison, and a friend of mine went to visit him and have political discussions with him, and Duque told the following story. A few years after this event, a few years after these workshops, Duque had gone to visit the jungle headquarters of the right-wing paramilitary, and his boss, a really terrifying character named Castaño, said, Ivan, we've done it finally, we've found out where Jaime Caicedo is. We've been looking for him for years, we found out where he is, and we have a hit squad going, we're going to get him tonight finally. And Ivan Duque said to his boss, you can't do that. We were in the scenario workshop together. It's true, he is a communist, but you know, we were on the team together. You can't assassinate him. And his boss said, Ivan, you know, we've been looking for him for years. This is our chance. The guys are going to be there, you know, any time now. And the assassination was called off. And the reason I think this story is interesting is not only for its drama, but to imagine what transformation must have occurred not only in the thinking of Ivan Duque and the relationship of Ivan Duque to others, but in what he would stand up for in a moment of being tested. And how do these conversations, not just with friends and colleagues, but with strangers and opponents, or enemies in this case, change not only what we think, but what we will stand for. The Colombian team developed a set of scenarios about what could happen in Colombia. There were four scenarios. The first, and they ended up naming them after well-known Colombian sayings or morals, moralejas. This idea that you could encapsulate a scenario about the future or a story in that the stories have morals. The first story, the first scenario, was called "The Morning Will Come and We'll See." And this was a story about what would happen if people just said, "Mañana, we'll deal with it tomorrow. There's nothing we can do today. We'll figure it out later." What would happen to the country, and how would it continue to sink deeper and deeper into the shit? The second scenario was a scenario about a negotiated settlement between the guerrillas and the government. The story was called, at least the English translation of the title was, "A Bird in the Hand is Worth Two in the Bush." That it's better to have a deal, even if we all give up stuff we consider important. It's better to compromise than to continue to fight. The third story was a story about what would happen if the violence continued, if the negotiations didn't work, and the population elected a government that said, "No more, we will crush the guerrillas." And this story was called "Everybody March," Todos a Marchar. And the fourth scenario was a scenario called "A Unity Makes Strength," a story essentially about the emergence of a grassroots movement which shifted the way Colombians thought about what was going on and about each other and what was possible. So far, these were interesting scenarios, technically well done, very beautifully written. If you look at the English translation on the website, you'll see that they're exceptionally beautifully and rationally, both rationally put together and written in a very poetic way, as Colombians can do. And the stories were disseminated very widely in Colombia. There were inserts in all the major newspapers. There was a video shown on all the television stations. There were mass meetings in, I think, 7 major cities. So they became very well known, and then as far as I could tell, nothing happened. And I went on to do other things.